We now look at language change. What is it that initiates, encourages language change, and what is it that discourages or avoids language change? To begin with, language change, it's natural. Many people might not think this, but it is. It happens in all languages, and it has always happened. Furthermore, it's very difficult to be stopped or controlled. You can ask the Académie Française if it's possible to control the amount of English coming to French. Attempts are made, but it's not always possible. And language change doesn't mean that a language is deteriorating. And it's one of the reasons why we have so many languages today. And probably it'll start to bother you when you're a bit older. Now, what keeps people talking the same? People talk excuse me. People talk in the same kind of manner if they feel that they are part of the same community. Also, if they have frequent interaction, and that there are no barriers to communication, either physical or social. And there's a sense of belonging of the same group, a kind of social solidarity. And this might change due to political, socio-economic reasons. It could be that two people, they don't interact so much as they've done before because of a border that's been set up. Examples of this are North and South Cyprus, where people hadn't spoken to each other for a long time, East and West Germany, for example. And so these are all things which encourage that people talk or continually keep speaking in the same kind of manner. If we now look at the opposite, where people do not feel that they are the same part of a community. This is one aspect, of course. And that there's irregular interaction. So these things, as mentioned, prevent people from speaking in the same manner. Now we've looked at that, let's look at the beginning of English in England. The beginning came during the collapse of the Roman Empire, or at the end of the Roman Empire. To be more exact, the Roman Empire was crumbling, and Roman soldiers were recalled from the Britons to defend other parts of the Roman Empire. And so politically speaking, or militarily speaking, Britain was empty. And although settled by Celts, not so many of them, it was ready for invasion around about 400 AD. So we talk about the first invasion. There were West Germanic invaders from Jutland and southern Denmark, and they began populating the British Isles in the 5th and the 6th centuries. And the three groups of invaders, we call them the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. They spoke German dialects which were different but mutually intelligible. But together this group was called the Anglo-Saxons, and the name England is derived from the word Angleland, the land of the Angles. This was the largest group, and they speak now a common language which we now call Old English. Now these invaders pushed the original Celtic-speaking inhabitants out of what is now England, and they were pushed into Scotland, Wales, Cornwall and Ireland, leaving behind a few Celtic names. Mostly these are place names, London, Avon, etc. This is always the case when you look at other parts of the world as well, where people have been forcibly removed. What has remained of the speakers of these people are place names. Now the Celtic languages, they survive today in the Gaelic languages of Scotland and Ireland, and in Welsh too. But about half of the most commonly used words in modern English, they seem to have an Old English root at least. Now the second Old English invasion was with the Vikings. The Viking invasion started in the early 800s. By this time we have a period known as Early Old English. Now the Vikings didn't displace English-speaking settlers. Instead, they lived side by side. And as a result, Old Norse has contributed a limited amount of words, but these words were central to the makeup of English. So for example, words like sister, law, They also the Viking invasion also contributed to words of Old Norse origin into English grammar, basic functional words as well. And examples of these are you have functional words such as these came from Old Norse, they, them, their. You have some prepositions here, and these words are pretty central to everyday language, and you notice how they have also come into English. Now the Old English period runs out about the 1100s, because at around about 1066, 1100 we talk about the Middle English period, and this came about because of the third invasion. And so you have William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, invaded England in 1066, and this new royalty spoke a dialect of Old French known as Anglo-Norman, I guess. And you have a situation where the nobles and the aristocracy and the landowners spoke French, but English was still the majority language spoken by most people. The influence of the Normans can be illustrated by looking at, for example, words like beef and cow. Beef was commonly eaten by the aristocracy, and it was a Normannic word, an Anglo-Normannic word, while the Anglo-Saxon word, the people who looked after the cattle, they retained the name cow. And many legal terms have Anglo-Norman roots because the Normans ran the courts. And there were many hundreds of words from Norman French that entered into the English language. Now, the nobles spoke French, the aristocracy spoke French, but over time they began to be bilingual. And the French nobles lost their loyalty to France, mainly because the French kings evicted the French nobles. They no longer had access to their lands in France. And so there was a greater tendency to, or a feeling of a community with the English speakers of Britain. And in 1349, the Black Death began, killing about 1/3 of the English population, and the middle class grew in economic and social importance, and along with that, English also increased in importance. The mixture of the two languages had an important effect of English, and Old English, the period before 1100, which was heavily inflected, that means there were lots of morphological endings. However, during the period 1100 to 1400, possibly because of French intonation patterns, there was a change in word stress, and as a consequence, many Old English words lost their inflectional endings. So English became a language which had less morphology, but more syntax. Now, what does that mean? You might have seen this in a previous video tutorial. And so the farmer saw the wolf. This here, the same thing is being said here. Word order is not of word order isn't important. It's because of these word endings that you see. This is the farmer saw the wolf. However, if you look at the wolf saw the farmer, you now notice in modern English, if you change the word order, then you change the meaning. So if you change the word order here and the word order here, there's a change in meaning. But now you can see that there are different morphological endings, and because of these morphological endings, it means something else. And what happened because of French influence on English, the word endings, they disappeared, and consequently syntax, word order, became more important. So the hearer can understand the basic concept of what is being said, but the message is unclear without the morphological endings. We now go on to a period called Early Modern English, and the next wave of innovation came with the Renaissance period. there was a revival of classical scholarship, and many classical Latin and Greek words were brought into the language. And a major factor in the development of modern English was the printing press, established by William Caxton. Consequently, books became cheaper, and as a result, literacy became more common. And publishing for the masses became a rather profitable enterprise, and works were more and more printed in English instead of Latin, which was, up until then, the lingua franca, the language of science, the language of tourism even. And you now notice that in the time period that we live in now, English has taken over this role that Latin used to have. Printing also brought about a standardization of English, and it was a dialect of the area, the triangle between London, Cambridge and Oxford. So Cambridge is here, London is here, Oxford is here, and this became the language spoken primarily by the people here became to be the standard, and dictionaries and grammar books were written using this kind of version. Finally, we have the period of late modern English, and this is the kind of English that we tend to use now in this day and age. Pronunciation, grammar and spelling are largely the same in late modern English and now, but late modern English has many more words, and these words, the influx of words, have two historical factors compared with Middle English, the Middle English time. The first is the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the technological society, and the second was the British Empire. And at its height, Britain ruled 1/4 of the Earth's surface, and English was adopted in many foreign countries, or many other countries, I should say. But although English has been transported to different parts of the world, lots of other languages have found their place within English. You have examples of Finnish, sauna, or Japanese, tycoon, or multiple other words, lots of other words. Hindi and other languages have contributed words like shampoo and pajamas and pundit. So, here's an overview of English language history. You have primarily these periods, and it's the Old English period here. Okay, and really this could be split up into two areas. I think more likely to be able to say 500 here. That's the Old English period. You have the Middle English period, and finally the Modern English period. And some important events here. You have, in terms of history, you talk about the Middle Ages, and this is this time here. Columbus discovered America in 1492, which this had a great effect on English. The end of the Middle Ages is also the beginning of the Renaissance. The colonies began to be established in the 1600 onwards. So this is language history here, and this is history here. As a comparison of the different kinds of English, you have the Lord's Prayer, and this is an example of Old English, which, if you try to read this, I think you'd find it rather difficult to understand. And this is because of all the morphological endings that are here. You begin to see things in early Middle English. Our Father that art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And late Modern English. Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, and so on. So English took a journey from being a Germanic language to Old English to Modern English. Now this change was not a demise, it was purely natural language change. And if you look closely at texts like the Lord's Prayer that you saw, there are differences in phonologically, morphologically, syntactically, lexically, and semantically. And an understanding of language change can help Swedish and other speakers to understand why English and their language is so different or similar. In the case of Swedish, why English and Swedish are so similar. Because both languages originate from the same source, and at one stage they could have been deemed to be dialects of the same language, like Norwegian and Swedish are today. Why is English so difficult to spell, and why are there so many English words for the equivalent of one in Swedish? Well, the reason for this is because printing was invented before the establishment of a written norm for written language. And England was quite bilingual at the time, at least among people who could read and write at the time the printing presses were established, and this had influence on the way things were written. Another reason why English is difficult to spell is because English is a language which is frequently borrowed freely from other languages, such as Old Norse and Norman French, French again, which we call Central French, Latin and Greek, and other non-European languages. By understanding language history, you can also understand why certain things are spelt in different ways, because thief is an Old English word that has regularly developed in accordance with other language changes, and the letter V was introduced by French scribes writing in English after the Old English period. Consequently, it became one thief and two thieves. In comparison, chief is a French loanword introduced after the Middle English period. It didn't exist in Old English, and this became, in its plural, chiefs. We can also explain why we have words like kids and girls and child and children instead of childs. For example, during the Old English period, you had kild and kildru, that was the plural. But a monk named Orm, a Danish name, living in Lincoln, wished for the Christian faith to be read out aloud in verse, and he devised his own spelling and wanted to distinguish between long and short vowels. And so, in his situation, you had kild and kildru, and there were changes in pronunciation which led to a change in morphological ending, and childru became, in its plural, to become children. So linguistic accident, in effect, is what would answer this. Linguistic accident. So what? You can say lexical differences are cute and interesting, but aside from that, why should we care? Well, we have to remember that English, Dutch and German started off as dialects of the same language, so the question is, could English evolve into several different languages in time to come? Try this out for yourself. Here are some new words from different parts of the English-speaking world. What do they mean? A knocking fee. You are eating my head. Snatch boys. Himalayan blunder. And here are some that you recognize already. Pavement and sidewalk. Apartment and flat. Tomato and tomato. These are English and American differences. But these here, a knocking fee, this is like a bribe. You're eating my head. My mother would say to me when I was a child, Matukaijai, which means you're eating my head, and it's you are annoying me. A snatch boy is a pickpocket, and a Himalayan blunder is a gigantic mistake. These are all examples of Indian English. These are examples of present-day differences in American English. And here you have examples of how language has come into regular usage of English. This came primarily from former black slaves who had moved up to the areas of Detroit in and around Northern America, and this was jazz talk. Similarly, from cowboy usage, these entered into the English language. If you're hot under the collar, it means you're very sweaty, you're under pressure. If you bite the dust, you've died, and so on. So changes in lexis might create differences, but they won't alone by themselves make different languages, because